I'm Lisa Robbin Young, and welcome to this behind-the-scenes episode of The Influencers. In the lead-up to our next show, the one where we find out who an indigenous rock guitarist, a Norwegian opera singer, and Tchaikovsky have in common, we're getting a little meta. In that, today's episode takes us all the way back to the beginning of this show, to the very first interview I ever did in putting together The Influencers. People have been asking how we actually got this show off the ground in the first place and how I do my research. Well, this is the very, very first step that we took. When I first pitched this show, hands down across the board, everybody at the studio said, there's one guy you need to talk to, and his name is Dr. Kyle Adams. Dr. Kyle Adams is a professor of music theory at Indiana University, but his depth and breadth of musical knowledge span the ages, as you will find out in our interview. You'll also very clearly know who our next mystery artist is by the end of this episode, because we really only talk about 3 people. When I first pitched the idea of doing this show, what I wanted to do was sit with music professionals and get their opinions on the musical family trees that I had built. So I would send them the trees in advance, and then they would tell me, yep, you got that right, or you forgot about that. And Kyle was the very first person who sat down with me. So you're gonna get to see the very early evolution of how this show began before it even hit the screen. So hop in the Wayback Machine with me to 2024, and let's talk to Dr. Kyle Adams. Let's start with Lizzo. As you look at Lizzo's tree, like, what can you tell me about that aspect of music?
So I have to say, so I looked at the first 3 artists on your list, Lizzo and Taylor Swift and Bruno Mars. I don't have a lot to add about Lizzo because there's so much there. And every time I thought, I was like, I wonder if she got, Big Freedia. Oh yeah, Big Freedia is like right there. It's one of the first things, Big Freedia, obviously known for being a drag performer or trans. I actually don't know how Big Freedia identifies as a trans woman or just as a drag performer. I've heard kind of both things. Well, as a singer, you've probably heard the term park and bark, right? Like they come on stage and here I am in all my glory. So that's I thought of Big Freedia. I thought of Aretha Franklin. I thought of Dionne Warwick. I thought of Diana Ross. And all those people are on the tree already. And so I think that is like, it's almost like a non-musical influence on Lizzo, but it's a, I don't know how to say it, kind of just like a cultural way of presenting herself. And at the same time, like, she's much more than somebody who just strides out on stage and sings, because she's a really excellent dancer. And I've seen her in concert, and, she can move. So she's not, the clips I've seen of, let's say, Aretha Franklin are more like she comes out and sings and does her thing, or she'll play the piano or whatever, but she's not like really, I've only seen clips of her when she's older, but she's not really getting down and moving and dancing and doing all the stuff that Lizzo does. So there's that I see as like 2 separate influences. There's the sort of like the black pop diva, which is when that's, again, the Diana Ross, the Patti LaBelle. And then there's also just the sort of like pop dancer, So, I mean, it's as weird as it seems to look at the 2 of them, I'd say that, like there's some kind of like Ariana Grande type influence in Lizzo as well. Just kind of like the post-millennial pop singer, dancer, entertainer person. So that, I mean, I don't know, but you have a lot of this stuff here. You have Cher on the tree already, which is great. That's another really good comparison, I think.
Well, talk about that. Talk about Cher and Aretha, like those 2 in particular. I'd love to hear your comparative like ideas and insights on that.
Well, I think of. I've never seen Aretha Franklin perform live. I've only seen, videos of her, but she's, again, to me, I see her as being the like I said, the big diva. I mean, she's like the diva's diva, right? The stage presence that the 2 of them have is amazing. And I think Cher is the same way, insofar as Cher is, like when we saw Cher in concert, she very much just sort of strides out into the middle of stage in a huge costume and big sets. I mean, she's very much an operatic performer, Cher is. And I see Lizzo as kind of a combination of those two, because she does, she comes out and she is who she is. I mean, there's also, um, sorry, with Cher, of course, there's the connection to the LGBTQ community, which Lizzo also has. I think in she's got a lot of support from the LGBTQ community, and she returns that support to them. Um, so there's that connection as well. And I guess if there's anything that I don't see explicitly on the tree, it's the LGBTQ. I mean, that's not a musical influence, but there's somehow like a lot of these artists that you have on here: Diana Ross and Cher, um, obviously Elton John. They're sort of like big, not influences, but trying to think of the word that I'm looking for, like mentors to the LGBT, or just like celebrated figures among the LGBTQ community. And Lizzo has taken on that role kind of too. Um, it's funny because I think a lot of people don't think of Lizzo as a rapper primarily, but she can rap. She's really really good. We studied her in my hip hop seminar this past spring, and so when you have Queen Latifah on there, but you've got connections to basically all of the big female rappers that I think precede her, especially Missy Elliott. I didn't see Nicki Minaj on there, although they're kind of the same generation, so I don't know if I would call her an influence on Lizzo, but she's certainly kind of the same type of rap artist. Um, Kind of like the very overtly sexual, sort of strong female character. So I think the hip hop side of the Lizzo one is really good.
Cool.
Um,
So let me ask you a couple questions. Let's talk
mhm.
about you for a minute, right? Because we kind of jumped into Lizzo, and I'm like, oh, we should probably talk about you and your background, because you were introduced to me as a person who has a deep knowledge of hip hop, but also very very early music. So who are you? What is your title? And tell me about the work that you do, the work that you've done, and the connections that you've made.
Yeah, so I'm Kyle Adams. I'm a professor of music theory here at Indiana University. Um, and so I got my PhD from the City University of New York, studying chromatic music of the 16th century. So I was a Renaissance music scholar, first of all. Um, as I was finishing my dissertation, one of the other faculty at CUNY was teaching a course called the Analysis of Hip Hop. And I've been a hip hop fan for, I mean, at this point, I've been a hip hop fan for 40 years. I've been listening since the early 80s. And so I asked this professor, I said, "Yeah, I'm finishing up my dissertation. I kind of want to do some reading. Can you send me your hip hop syllabus?" And I didn't realize, this was around 2005, I didn't realize that hip hop was a thing that you could study in academia. Um, so I got this woman's syllabus and I read all the articles that were there, and started thinking about my own analytical work. And when I interviewed here at IU, they asked me what class I would love to teach. Like, what would be my dream class? And so I said analysis of hip hop music. And to my surprise, the music theory faculty at IU were really, really supportive of that idea. And so I've been teaching hip hop classes here. I taught my first one in 2007. I published on the analysis of hip hop music a lot. It's one of those things that I didn't really expect it to take off. I thought it'd be like I'd do a couple articles on hip hop and then that would be it, and I'd go back to early music. But it's really kind of become my main thing. I still do some early music work. I teach classes on Renaissance counterpoint here and on history of music theory. Um, but the hip hop stuff has kind of really become my main area of scholarship. So yeah, it just kind of was something I fell into.
So
It's
why hip hop? Like, what do you love about it? What do you hate about it? Tell me what you're passionate about here.
well, from a scholarly perspective, I I liked Renaissance music and hip hop music for the same reason, which is that there wasn't a lot of like analysis of those two areas of music. So, a lot of what we do, and this, having studied music theory at a major institution, a lot of it is, Western art music of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And that is music that I love. I have degrees in piano performance. I'll never not love Beethoven. But the world kind of didn't need another third-rate Beethoven scholar, which is what I would have been. you know. But I found that I was drawn to Renaissance music originally just because of the difficulty of sort of figuring out what's going on. And then with hip hop, it was the same thing. I like I said, I loved hip hop music for years, and nobody was really doing analysis in the way that they do analysis on Brahms or Schubert or or uh, Mozart or whoever else. So that was kind of the task that I set myself to. What I find fascinating about hip hop is just it's kind of like rhythm for rhythm's sake. A lot of it, I get in arguments with people all the time. Because I'm not a lyrics person. I'll know a song for 20 years before I realize what it's about. Um, I can sing along with it, but I just don't pay attention to what the meaning of the lyrics. So what's always fascinating me about hip hop is this really intricate interplay with the rhythm of the words and the rhythm of the beat. Um, I grew up listening to hip hop in what they call the golden age, which is about 1988 to 94, 95, when the hip hop beats were sort of cobbled together from a collage of samples of black music, of James Brown and the Bar-Kays and Idris Muhammad and all these other great artists, Parliament Funkadelic. And so that's another thing that kind of fascinates me is taking four or five pieces of music and combining them into a new beat. And then rapping over that beat in a way that's sort of musically interesting. So that's the kind of stuff that fascinates me about hip hop. And so, yeah, I've been very fortunate to be at an institution that supports that.
Cool. Cool. So then when you're looking at people to study in your
Mhm.
hip hop class, why did you choose Lizzo?
Um, One, I feel like from a very practical and maybe sociocultural perspective, um, it's 2024. We can't sort of ignore women in hip hop anymore. So I think the first hip hop class I ever taught, there may have been one female artist. I might have used Nicki or I think probably Queen Latifah was the first person. And even then, 2007, I shouldn't have been ignoring female hip hop artists either. But now it's like, there's enough really great. There's such a strong female presence in the world of hip hop. And the newer artists are good too. Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, and I already mentioned Nicki Minaj. Chica is somebody who I think is a fantastic hip hop artist. But Lizzo is kind of um, a towering figure over all these people. And I guess I don't remember when it was, but sometime in the past couple of years, I heard some of her early stuff from like 2013. And I kind of thought of her as somebody who was primarily a singer, but who also rapped. But in her earlier work, I mean, she really really established herself as a talented rapper. And that gets overshadowed a little bit by her more recent stuff, the real top 40 music that she's put out. So I wanted my students to see her as a really important figure in the development of hip hop, and especially women in hip hop.
Cool. Now you said Queen Latifah. So let's talk about her through your eyes a little bit so that we can
Hmm.
get the perspective, because in my research, she has an influence because of where she stood as a pioneer in women in rap for
Hmm.
Lizzo. Um, but musically, I wasn't finding a lot of, interpersonal connections. So let's talk about Queen Latifah
Hmm.
as her own person and how she fits into the world of hip hop. Because I'd love to get
Yeah.
your inputs on it.
Um, so a lot of the way that I've started thinking about hip hop, there's a scholar named Cheryl Keys who I believe got her doctorate here at IU, and wrote a dissertation on hip hop music. But Professor Keys talks about four sort of female stereotypes in hip hop, not stereotypes, but female roles in hip hop music. And the first one she talks about is the Queen Mother. And so there's the Queen Mother, the Sister with Attitude, the Fly Girl, and the Lesbian. Those are her four categories of female hip hoppers. And the Queen Mother is exemplified by Queen Latifah. Um, what she has in common with Lizzo is again, they are um, very strong women who are unafraid to kind of be themselves, right? Um, Now, musical influences, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. Right? I can talk about what I think about Queen Latifah. So you asked me to do that, so I'll do that. Um, in my mind, as somebody growing up in the world of hip hop, um, the around 88, 89, 1990 was a real change in the way that hip hop artists presented themselves. Um, so, early 80s hip hop was all, throw your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care. In the mid 80s, hip hop started to go pop with Run DMC, and kind of cross over into mainstream music. And so the women artists around there were, MC Light was the big one. And she was still kind of rapping about sort of, pardon me, just about life in New York City. Um, Queen Latifah came along, and she was part of the Native Tongues group. Do you know about the Native Tongues?
No, I don't. Please tell me more.
Okay, so I don't know who started the Native Tongues Collective, but it was the groups were De La Soul, A Tribe Called Quest, the Jungle Brothers, Black Sheep was part of it too, and then Queen Latifah and Moni Love. And so it was this collective of hip hop artists from New York, and they dedicated themselves to kind of positivity, Afrocentric hip hop. They were the first ones to like they never wore gold chains. They wore like Africa medallions, regular street clothes. They presented themselves as just not impoverished by any means, but just sort of like middle class people who were interested in African history and kind of like in uplifting their communities. And so Queen Latifah was a part of that. And so her song "Ladies First," the first big song that I know by her, is all about powerful women throughout African history and how she's like putting herself in that lineage of strong African or African American women. And in the video for "Ladies First," you can see like she's in like military garb, kind of pushing around chess pieces on a table, and so she has this bearing, like she just carries herself very regally. That's not a word, but whatever. But she acts like royalty, and that, of course, that's in her name too. And so that's the influence that I see in Lizzo. I'd be astonished if Lizzo did not cite Queen Latifah as one of her influences in terms of the image that she presents to the world. Again, like Aretha Franklin or like these really powerful black female artists of the 70s and 80s and 90s. Queen Latifah and Lizzo both come out as rappers, just sort of they're not going to be um, they're not going to be subjugated to the sort of male power structures in America, especially in the music industry. Um, they both kind of have a way of sort of reclaiming their sexuality. So they're not viewed through the sort of what they call the male gaze. They're just their own women. And so that's the kind of influence I see with Queen Latifah. So I don't know if that helps, but that's where I'm getting at.
Yeah. No, that's great. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's zoom out. What else caught your eye as you were looking through the trees? Who else did you want to talk about?
Well, Taylor Swift for sure, but Bruno Mars, if we can go to him next.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Yeah, because he's an interesting person. I was looking through the tree, and I think I looked through all of it. But what I didn't see, wow, Zoroastrianism. I missed that the first time. Sorry. What I didn't see in Bruno Mars was the '90s New Jack Swing music. Is that anywhere in the tree? Did I miss that?
I think the closest thing I got as I was building out the tree was I think he made a reference to Boys to Men somewhere, and so that
Okay.
was about as close as I was able to get. But I mean, let's talk New Jack
Okay.
Swing. Why don't we?
Yeah, I mean, so the song that my favorite Bruno Mars song by a long shot is "Finesse," the one they did with Cardi B. And that the direct influence there is New Jack Swing. So the big figure in New Jack Swing in the '90s was Teddy Riley, who was a producer. It's kind of, I don't know, it's hard to describe exactly what characterizes New Jack Swing, but if you listen to Poison by Belle Biv DeVoe and then you
Sure.
listen to Finesse by Bruno Mars, they are like there's such a clear influence there. It's the drum sounds that they use, the type of drum beats that they use. There's a lot of timbral influences in the bass line, and so that's something that I would definitely put in Bruno Mars. Maybe I think it would probably go under the R&B. side of the tree, like along with Bobby Brown and Motown. Um, so I that's all I really have to say about that. But there's a the thing I feel like Bruno Mars is really good at doing is assimilating previous styles of music. Um, so he's got his 70s. You've got Silk Sonic on there, which is like this total 1970s neo soul kind of thing. And then the stuff from, I don't know when Finesse came out, 2016, 2017, but that's clearly like a 90s throwback. And again, when we saw him in concert, they were doing like the dances I remember from being in high school. Like he's really really good at somehow just assimilating those styles and making them his own. So that's what I wanted to say about Bruno.
Well, there are folks who, and there's some controversy around Bruno Mars and his
Mm,
ability to assimilate almost to the point of not just lifting but outright plagiarizing
hmm
other artists. And so there's a lot of like he's a dangerous person to talk about in terms of musical influence, because so much of what he's bringing to the world sometimes it's hard to tell whether it's inspired by or just stolen from. And I know he's a songwriter, so can we talk about those fine lines in general, but also as it relates to Bruno Mars?
Yeah, I mean that's really really tricky. And I'm not a copyright lawyer. I know very very little about the legal aspects of this. So don't quote me from a legal perspective by any
Sure,
means.
sure.
You know, yes, Bruno Mars has taken influences from a lot of different places. Um, I don't know when one crosses the line from like imitation to sampling to plagiarism. Um, with the New Jack Swing stuff with Finesse, to me it's just like, well, he loved that style, and he or his producers were able to find the kind of synthesizer timbres that they used back in the 90s, and he just used the same sounds. um, it's a little bit like, to me, criticizing Bruno Mars for sort of copying New Jack Swing style would be like criticizing Beethoven for copying Mozart because they both wrote for the orchestra. It's just like they took the same sonic palette and did different, like similar things with it in their own unique way. And I feel that way about the 70s stuff with Silk Sonic. It's not like um, he's deliberately. I wouldn't say there's anywhere in Bruno Mars where he's plagiarizing Marvin Gaye or any of the great soul singers. To me, it sounds a lot like he's taking that sonic palette and he's making it into his own thing.
For me, that was the thing that got me really curious about Bruno Mars, because I mean, he really rose as a songwriter first and a performer second. I mean, unless you count his Elvis impersonations when he was 4, he was really more of a
Right.
writer than a performer.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
to see, like he sold one of his early songs to CeeLo Green, and so that's how CeeLo Green ends up in his
Mhm.
his family tree. And
Right.
CeeLo Green has his own very interesting path of musical influences that kind of blew my
Mhm.
mind. But he's never been afraid. Bruno Mars has never been afraid to just hear something and say, okay, how can I pull that into this? And how can I pull? And he just kind of weaves these tapestries of these throwback tunes.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
do you see anything original in Bruno Mars?
Yeah, because he's putting his own stamp on things. You know, I mean, it's funny because we always, we by the general public, we tend to criticize artists for, like, as you're saying, like they take the throwback style, right? And so he'll take an earlier style of music and kind of copy it, right? But I feel like every artist is making music according to their influences. And so it's no different for him to imitate music of an earlier style than it is for a modern pop artist to imitate the other kind of pop music that's going on right now. Um, so we don't see, we don't look at Dua Lipa and Ariana Grande as, copying each other, because they're making music in what is the dominant style right now. So it's easy to look at Bruno Mars and say he's copying or he's stealing from an earlier style because nobody else is doing that style right now. But if Bruno Mars had made Finesse in 1992, it would have just sounded like, oh yeah, that's what people are doing these days. So he's making music in that style. So is there something original? I mean, yeah, there's something original in Bruno Mars, to the extent that there's something original in any artist kind of just like taking a current trend and putting their own spin on it. So like, again, if like in the early 90s you had Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots and Pearl Jam and what's their faces, Chris Cornell's group, who was Soundgarden, um, who were all, at the time we were all making music that all sounded the same. It was all the grungy, angsty guitars with the really gravelly vocals. I thought all of those groups were original in their own way. If somebody made grunge rock now, would it be original? I mean, yeah, it would. It would be just as original if they were making grunge music in 1992. It's just it's more obvious when somebody's lifting from an earlier style if nobody's doing that style anymore.
Cool.
And in that way, if you want to connect Bruno Mars and Bach, then this is a bit of a tenuous connection, but that's the same kind of thing that Bach was known for, right? Is traveling all over, listening to all the music that he could possibly listen to, and then assimilating those earlier styles into his own music.
So you raise an interesting point then. And I know that earlier music is also one of your areas of expertise. I'm not even sure how to ask the question, because in my research, Bach was, as you just said, pulling from everywhere that he could to see what was going on in the music of the day and what could he do to make that his. Was that a common practice for composers in that time, or was he really an outlier?
No, again, 18th century is not my thing, so I'm going to be telling you what I remember from music history classes, but and
Sure.
so I'm not sure I have more expertise in this area than you do, but I think he was an outlier in that. Like, I mean, the other composers that I can think of from that time, um, you know, Handel, of course, was writing high Baroque polyphonic music, and arias, again, the da capo arias and stuff that we know. Um, and the Scarlatti father and son were doing opera. I'm trying to think who else was like a contemporary of Bach. Um, I guess Vivaldi was a little bit earlier, but I don't think anybody in Germany was doing what Bach was doing in terms of Bach somehow getting a hold of music by Palestrina or whoever and like copying that style. Like I don't again and again I may be wrong, so take this with a massive grain of salt. Like I don't know any
Sure.
music by Handel or by Domenico Scarlatti that's written in this like very old 16th century style like some of Bach's stuff is. Um, so yeah, I think he is kind of an outlier there.
Well, let's talk about, I guess, for me, the evolution of polyphony that brings us to Bach, right? Because there's not a lot of just generic music history information available in the world without combing a whole lot of archives of time, right, to get us to the names that we know, right? The names that we know, like Bach, the names that we know, like Palestrina, like how did we get there?
So I mean, to give a very very cartoonish version of the story, um, over the course of, gosh, 500 years, maybe 600 years, between about the turn of the year 1000 and maybe 1600 or like 1500. I mean, the story of music in Western Europe is that it gets gradually more polyphonic. So we start with chant, we add another voice, maybe another two voices to the chant, um, and then gradually the voices that we're adding to the chant get more and more elaborate. Eventually, we can take the chant away altogether, and we still have these sort of elaborate contrapuntal voices. Again, this is a very simplified version of the story, but it's more or less how it happened. By the 1500s, which is the music that I kind of specialize in, music in the church, which for all intents and purposes is music at that point, because that's the stuff that gets written down, passed down through generations. Where folk music, we don't know a ton about it, but sacred music is for usually 3, 4, or 5 voices. It's polyphonic, meaning that each line has its own individual melody. There's not a distinction between melody and harmony. There aren't chords the way that we think of it now. And that is replaced in Italy in the beginning of the 17th century. That's replaced in Italy with early opera. And the way that it's usually presented in music history classes is that they decide that instead of the words serving the music, that the music is now going to serve the words. Okay, so the Italian composers of the early 1600s decide, and they're also they're also studying ancient Greek music, and they learn that ancient Greek music is just a single voice accompanied by instruments. And so they decided they're going to do that because the Renaissance, of course, was a renaissance of ancient Greece and Rome. So these composers like, Peri and Caccini and Vincenzo Galilei, who's the father of Galileo Galilei, they're all centered in Florence in the around 1600. And they start writing music that's just a single voice accompanied by instruments, right? So and that's exactly where we get opera from, right? Gradually, as you can imagine, opera develops into what it would become in the middle of the 18th century. So there's, now instead of just one, single voices one at a time alternating with each other, they add choruses and they add duets but all during this time, of course, the sacred music that they had been familiar with keeps going, right? So people are still writing 4-part choral music for church. So that's a style that continues throughout the 1600s, along with opera. When we get into the middle to late part of the 1600s, a bunch of composers start writing instrumental music that there is trying to imitate the way that voices work in operatic textures. So then you have your Corelli and your Vivaldi writing really virtuosic violin music. And the Italian style of those composers is very accessible. It's fun to listen to. It's very spirited. And it, also very much sort of a melody plus accompaniment kind of a thing, right? And so we have all and so again, we still have, the 4-part learned sacred style that comes out of the Renaissance, or the early Renaissance. We have the new operatic style, which is just voice plus one instrument. We have we have secular choral music that's now part of the operatic tradition. And now we have instrumental music just for the sake of instrumental music. And so Bach then is the person that takes all of these styles and tries his hand at each of them. So I don't know. I confess, I just don't know where he learned all this music from. But he assimilates all of those things into his music.
All right, so let's shift gears and talk about Taylor Swift. What did you find? What did I miss? What can you tell me?
I mean, the funny thing about Taylor is that your tree here has like a whole bunch of genres on it right at the beginning, like country, rock, folk, pop, and electronic. And I think that's accurate with Taylor. She is at heart a country artist, but she is very good at assimilating pop styles and folk styles and EDM, electronic music. A lot of that, I think, is Jack Antonoff, her producer and collaborator. I think he's very good at taking a bunch of different styles and assimilating them. I didn't see bluegrass in Taylor Swift, and it's one of those things where I can't tell you exactly like what bluegrass artist, but I feel like there's that in sort of the intersection of folk music and country music is bluegrass, which is folky. It's got an emphasis on very skilled instrumental playing, like banjo and fiddle playing, and you can see images of Taylor Swift holding a banjo. Like she can play the banjo. Um, there's also a sort of with a lot of bluegrass music, there's a heavy Christian aspect to it, and I think Taylor kind of keeps her faith out of her music. I don't know offhand any songs where she talks about being Christian. I don't. To be honest, I don't even know if she is. Um, but I feel like there's a bluegrass in so like the song. The song "Mean" was the first one that I thought of that was a real, like, to me, has a bluegrass sound to it. And I can't put my finger on it, but that's a branch of the tree that I would try to explore a little bit, is just bluegrass
Okay.
influences on Taylor Swift. Um, but the funny thing is that the other thing, so you've got pop and you've got NSYNC and Gwen Stefani and Britney Spears. Um, when I think of pop and Taylor Swift, I mean her maybe most popular song ever is "Shake It Off." From 2015, 2016. And that is like to me, a direct, again, I don't want to say copy, imitation or something of Mickey by Tony Basil from 1983 or something like that. But it's got the same like kind of cheerleader half rap sound to it. So Tony Basil's got to be in there somewhere in the pop part of the tree. Um,
Well,
I mean,
now,
Tony
okay, so you
Basil's
say
different.
that.
Yeah,
You say that, but
yeah.
I'm also thinking of is it Avril Lavigne's song that does that
Hmm.
same kind
Oh, the
of
boyfriend
clappy
song? Yep.
rappy?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. So that would be there too.
Okay, cool.
Um, but I think Tony Basil's the first person to do that. And again, I'd be surprised if Taylor hadn't at least heard that song. Um, it's one of those things I don't like. I don't necessarily consider myself a Swiftie, but I do like her music. Like I listen to a lot of her music, but she seems to just know an astonishing amount of music. Like in terms of just like the way the styles of music that she does. So I would say, yeah, the Shake It Off thing with Tony Basil is one thing, and then I don't know if this is Taylor or if it's Jack Antonoff, but um, on the Midnight's album, there's a whole bunch of weird stuff going on there. Like the electronica influence is huge on that album, um, and so what was it? She or Antonov, one of them, uses a Moog synthesizer, um, and that is a direct callback to like progressive rock of the 1970s. So then we get like influences from like Yes and Rush and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and all these like prog rockers from 40 years prior. Um, I mean, again, anybody hearing a Moog synthesizer is gonna pick up on that immediately. And there's the song, shoot, I don't remember which song it is from Midnight's. I think it's Midnight Rain. So that's the one that uses the Moog really heavily. Um, so yeah, so again, I don't know, other than her or Antonov listening to a lot of that music, I don't know where that influence would have come from. But nobody's used a Moog synthesizer for like 40 years. It's like just disappeared from the pop landscape. So when she comes out with that in Midnights, I'm like, okay, somebody in her studio is listening to 70s progressive rock, and they're like enjoying it and wanting to create that sound. Um,
Well, so for those of us who don't know, who is Jack Antonoff? Talk about who he is.
I don't know a lot about him either. I just know that he's Taylor
Sure.
Swift's producer, and he's I just a big name in post millennial music production. Um,
Okay.
he's also, if you've ever heard of the group Fun, that's kind of like a super group formed with a bunch of people, but he's the guitarist for that group. He's one of those names, like you've got Max Martin on there, and Max Martin and Jack Antonoff are just huge names in pop music production now. And then, the other thing that you've got Tim McGraw in here, you've got Shania Twain, you've got Faith Hill, the Dixie Chicks, Leanne Rimes. But what I would do under the country part of the Taylor Swift tree, right? A lot of people, I don't know where this comes from, but a lot of people divide country music into like Texas country and Nashville country. Um, and so there's like the really old school, country music, like the Willie Nelson and I don't know, Kenny Rogers, Waylon Jennings, and those people.
Merle
Um,
Haggard, yeah.
yeah, and I don't see that as very much of an influence on Taylor Swift. But the '90s Nashville country, of course, is huge. So that's the Tim McGraw and Faith Hill and Shania Twain and Leanne Rimes, um, Deanna Carter. Who else am I forgetting about? Um, I should know because my wife listens to all this stuff. But that to me is like got to be the main influence on Taylor Swift growing up is like the '90s Nashville country slash. But Kenny Chesney's another one. Um, and so again, I'm convinced that she was listening to all that stuff when she was writing her earlier music.
Well, you know the story of her going to Nashville when she was like 11 and knocking on doors on Music Row saying, "Hey, my name's Taylor Swift and I want a record deal. Call me." And she gave all of these karaoke tapes of her singing. She didn't get a call, but 2 years later, she's back in Nashville. They've
Yeah,
moved to Nashville, and you know that would have been late '90s. So
yeah. I didn't know about that. That's really interesting, though. And that's funny because that by the late '90s, early 2000s, like that era of country music was kind of ending. So I'm not surprised that she then remade herself in kind of a country slash pop star. Um, so yeah. I don't have much else to say about that, but yeah.
So even though we really only talked about three major artists in this episode, we covered a lot of ground and you got a little sampling of just how much Dr. Adams really knows when it comes to music. Think you know who our mystery artist is? I mean, I can't imagine that you don't. But let us know in the comments or visit us at our website, wfiu.org/theinfluencers. Next time we'll reveal our mystery artist and show you where an indigenous rock guitarist, a Norwegian opera singer, and Tchaikovsky are all found in her musical family tree. Until then, I am Lisa Robbin Young reminding you that you never know what kind of an impact you make on the world around you. Who influences you?